All right, I think we can get started. I want to welcome everybody to this week's LaRouche Pack Saturday night class. Tonight, I'm Susan Kokinda. Tonight, I'm being joined by two of my colleagues who will sort of be riding shotgun, Brian Lance and Bob Ingram, because the purpose of tonight's discussion is to get a running start on the class series which Bob and Brian will be launching in June. We're going to take a break next week over the Memorial Day weekend, but on the first Saturday in June, we're going to be starting an extraordinarily important discussion on the principles and the practice of national banking. What it is we have to begin to understand and be prepared to act upon in order to replace the tragically and horribly failing Federal Reserve System and the globalist system within which it exists as it's failing today. And look, this is not a moment too soon for this discussion. Every family, every American who's not a member of the privileged class is being buffeted by inflation, by shortages, by things that we have never experienced, at least in our lifetimes. And today I was struck by a post in one of these local neighborhood apps in which a young mother posted the following. She posted, "I found formula. I had to drive to 4 stores and 1 liquor store to find formula today. I was able to buy 5 cans. But what everyone isn't talking about is the emotional part of this formula shortage. I never thought this could ever happen. I never thought that the food that literally feeds our babies would be slim to none." Now, tonight, we're going to hear from somebody who did know that this could happen, who warned that this would happen if we stayed on the path that we've been on for many decades. And that person is Lyndon LaRouche. He foresaw this because he was a scientist, because he was a philosopher, and what he understood is that economy is fundamentally about 2 processes. One, the creation, or right now the lack thereof, of the physical goods that comprise our society, and the human mind that makes the discoveries which allow us to produce those physical goods. And he understood that when you ignore those processes, or worse, you hold them back or you destroy them, you face an existential crisis. And we are there. We are at the end of a system which for over 100 years has been dominated by the private central banking system, of which our Federal Reserve is our unfortunate institutional form of. That system has not been based on advancing human creativity and productivity or on the physical economy. They only tolerate the physical economy, frankly, to the extent that it benefits them. Their system instead is based on money, and it's based on the power that money affords them. And embedded in that is its own doom, because it can't create, it can only loot. And we are at the end of this system, and we'd better be prepared to replace it. Now, fortunately, we're not starting from scratch. We have great figures in our nation's history who understood the fundamentals of how human beings should organize a physical economy. Human beings should organize it, not monetary formulas or computer programs. Those great figures were Alexander Hamilton, Abraham Lincoln, and Lyndon LaRouche. And tonight we're going to hear from Lyndon LaRouche in the form of an excerpt of a speech he gave in 2009. But the reason that we have called for building a movement in this country to carry out a 3rd American economic revolution is precisely because we must stand on the shoulders of Alexander Hamilton and Abraham Lincoln. Now, in what the excerpt of a speech we're going to present from Mr. LaRouche is a 2009 speech. It came in the wake of the 2008 crisis, in which we solved nothing. And in fact, we only intensified the insane policies of bailout and economic disintegration, which got us where we are. We're on the verge right now of something much worse than 2007, 2008. Inflation, maybe even hyperinflationary blowout, on top of a completely broken physical economy, far, far, far more broken than it was in 2007 and 2008. But politically, we are in a very different situation than 2007, 2008. Then a majority of the American population were, in a sense, spectators of a political process in Washington, D.C. They might be able to put their thumbs up or their thumbs down to a policy, but they had very little power to actually enforce it. People may remember that when Congress was considering the bailout of these criminal speculative financial institutions in 2008, the first time the vote went before the House of Representatives, it failed because the American population shouted louder than many of these congressmen had ever heard. I mean, we know we were in the middle of that mobilization, and staffers in these congressional offices were telling us they'd never received so many phone calls in their lives. But then the forces of the global financial elite weighed in this case through various parties in the Bush administration. And they warned the Congress that unless they carried out a bailout, there would be financial disintegration, chaos, rioting in the streets, and martial law. And Congress capitulated. And the American people had very, very little power at that point to stand up to the brutal fist coming down from the global financial elite on our nation. But now we have a movement. We didn't have a movement then. You had people who were angry and upset and had the right impulse to stop this insane bailout. But we have a movement now. It was brought to life by the election of Donald Trump and by his presidency and by the battle to defend him and defend the nation from the ongoing political assault, which has all the aspects of a coup. Millions of Americans no longer consider themselves spectators. They have, just someone who can at best scream at somebody over the telephone in a congressional office or throw their shoe at their screen. We have growing political power at all levels of society. We don't have power. We have growing political power. And citizen patriots and Trump-backed candidates are now challenging the establishment everywhere from school board up to critical federal congressional offices at the Senate level and at the level of the House of Representatives, and absolutely everything in between. And what we're seeing with the growth of this political power, with the fact that people are becoming much more self-conscious of the power that a citizen actually has, if properly focused and properly organized and properly mentally armed with the principles which are the bedrock of our nation, what they're discovering is that they do have political power. And what we're seeing in our organizing everywhere is that because of that, because people are beginning to get a sense, once again, I'm a citizen. I'm a citizen of a republic. And maybe I actually better know how to govern. Maybe I have to know how to implement policies, not just scream and fight against the evil that's falling down upon us. So people are ready to fight. And we're finding that with this sense of power, there is a growing hunger and a growing capacity to actually understand what happened to our nation and what happened to our economy. And they are ready for the big fight, which we have defined in terms of its initial focal point as shutting down the Federal Reserve and replacing it with a national bank, replacing it with American constitutional national banking. And people are now ready to, increasingly ready to roll up their sleeves and begin to figure out, all right, how would that work? How do you run an economy without a private central banking system? So the time is now for this discussion because we have a new audience. We have a different audience. It's not the audience of 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Well, maybe we can audit the Fed. No, this is a different kind of an audience. This is an audience of citizens who are beginning to grapple with the fact that the system is indeed completely broken. We are going to have to shut it down and replace it. And that demands and necessitates that we actually understand the principles of what it is we're going to put in its place. So what we're going to do tonight is, again, a kind of prelude to the discussion which Brian and Bob will be carrying out over the subsequent Saturdays starting in June. We're gonna introduce this with a 30-minute excerpt of a speech which Lyndon LaRouche gave, as I mentioned, in 2009 in the wake of the last economic crisis. It's about a 30-minute excerpt of this speech. And then afterwards, Bob and Brian are going to briefly give a sense of what they're going to do in the subsequent weeks in the class. And then we're going to open it up for a free-for-all discussion with the audience and with our panelists. So I'm going to share my screen.
We're going to have to recognize that the Federal Reserve System is, by any appropriate approach, bankrupt. It is a private corporation which was created, unfortunately, by the US government, in a certain manner of speaking, under Woodrow Wilson. It is bankrupt. Who is going to pay those debts? All this money issued is a debt. All this utterance is a debt. Who is supposed to pay? Who contracted to pay that debt? I know that the Federal Reserve System is bankrupt. It covers up for its bankruptcy by printing money. This reminds me of Germany in the 1923, doesn't it? Isn't it? No, therefore, look, the point is, the United States has to have the guts to declare the Federal Reserve System bankrupt. That's the way to get at it. It is bankrupt. And let it prove that it has assets to cover this utterance. If not, we put it into bankruptcy. What we do is we simply get rid of it by bankruptcy. Just take it off the books. It's bankrupt. It took itself off the books by going bankrupt. Easiest way of skinning that cat. All right, now, then what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to develop the third national bank of the United States. And what we will do with that is it is essentially assigned to the Treasury, but it's not an extension of the Treasury otherwise. It has a relationship to the Treasury by being authorized. But a third national bank, exactly as Hamilton prescribed in the first national bank. And we will take a little carefully guarded barbed wire, etc. thing down to the basement of the Third National Bank, and inside will be the remains of the Federal Reserve System, held in captivity for purposes of audit only. And that's the way to get rid of it, because we have to manage. You see, we have to manage the relationship which the Federal Reserve System has established with the chartered banks of the states and the national banks. We have to rescue those. Now, we're going to do that, what? By a Glass-Steagall kind of cleanup act of all these banks. We're going to have to create credit to keep these banks, many of which are bankrupt, but are essential to communities, functioning. We're going to have to use these banks as a way of saving them, as a way of generating the distribution of credit to maintain an economic recovery. Now, we have then this private-public relationship. And how do we deal with that? And also with international accounts. We deal with that through a national bank. So we use the national bank as a facility to promote things. Now, what we also need are projects conceived like in the form of the Tennessee Valley Authority. Now that's an ideal thing because it had a primary purpose, but it also had a lot of other things that went with it to fulfill its primary purpose. So what we need is a national transportation development under some name, which essentially takes care of this railroad maglev system and takes care, as the Tennessee Valley did, of all the things which are auxiliary to that system. We need a national transportation system which is oriented to an agro-industrial mission. We need to get a situation nationally so that we don't have super industries. Look, in this area, for example, people commute into the Washington area for 2 hours, 2 hours and a half each way under traffic conditions. This is insane because we reconcentrated employment in such a way as to create this condition. Under normal conditions in the United States, in the 20th century, your commuting time was to and from work was about 15 minutes, at most half an hour. We now have 2 hours, 2.5 hours in this area, and similar things in other areas. The effect of that on family life is monstrous, particularly when you have two adult members of the household are maintaining a family with children. What the hell is the result of having 2.5 hours of transport each way every day? Are you human? We destroyed the entire development of the Western United States. We concentrated everything in a few areas. We congested them with automobile traffic instead of efficient mass transportation systems. We should have decentralized. We shouldn't have built such big, giant, oversized corporations. We should have built smaller units distributed in various parts of the country in the rational way we used to approach this. So we need a national development program which is based on this function of transportation, which means also building the water system, the Nawapa water system, and other things, because we have a real problem with water supplies in the western states. We're going to have a food supply problem. We're destroying agriculture. We're destroying the industrial-agricultural relationship with the globalization and other kinds of insanity. So what we need for this period is national mission orientations of the type that Roosevelt used and Wallace used. We know those kind of approaches to take the infrastructure development of the nation, thinking of it as a living economy, and thinking about it as a place where people live and work and have homes and have schools and have medical facilities, and think of that and say we need a national transportation reorganization plan for the United States. We have a vast territory, relatively speaking, and we should just go back and develop it. And the way to do it is start with your transportation grid, knowing where you're going, and the transportation grid is coupled with your water problem, the water management problem, both for traffic and for water management, and building up the aquifers, an area where they're being destroyed, and taking advantage of that. Forestation instead of greenie. A tree is worth much more than grass. A tree has up to 10% of the solar radiation used by a tree is incorporated in the tree. The grass, 1-2%. So you want to have more trees, you want to have a reforestation program for areas, you want a development territory. All of this comes under the question of transportation. And we need probably a national transportation project, like a national space program or an international space program. And these kinds of programs will drive us as long as we have a future orientation in the direction we want to go in. We have to think about 2 generations now. What are your young guys, what are your grandchildren going to look like? What kind of life are they going to have? Who's going to get to Mars first? And who's going to be able to get back? In other words, you use national long-term credit, investing in technological progress, getting from autos on the street into railroads, for example. Things like that. These kinds of things which increase the physical productivity per capita per square kilometer of the nation. But this always requires new sources of power, better sources of power, large-scale capital improvements, these kinds of things, which, like the TVA, like the things that Roosevelt did, to build up the structure of the economy through the infrastructure sector. We don't have many industries left in the United States. They've been destroyed. How are we going to build these industries up? Well, we have people who used to work in the auto industry. The auto industry has been shut down, essentially, except for the Japanese department of it. And even they're suffering. So we've lost the industries. But the auto industry was never an auto industry. The auto industry, as we looked at it in terms of World War II, was essentially a machine tool business. We produced airplanes. We produced locks and dams. We produced railway systems. We produced all kinds of things with the skills based in the Great Lakes area, in the industrial and agricultural base of the Great Lakes area. We built it up. Now, these swine have destroyed it all. We still have the locations. We still have the people in the Great Lakes area. We still have people with skills. We don't have an auto industry. We destroyed that. But these communities are capable of doing other things besides making automobiles. They can make large-scale railway systems. They can make power systems or elements of power systems. They can rebuild our river systems, our locks and dams. And all of this will contribute to good. We're not asking people to accept handouts. We're giving them work. Or we'll give them handouts where they need it to get them through. But the essential thing, we want to give them productive work, where they can build things that have permanent value for the United States. Not just waste our money. And so forth, we have to get in that direction. To get on some of the technical questions here, let's take on this, just a minute from now, this triple curve, which I've used as a pedagogical device since about the beginning of 1996. And I suppose we can play that up. And I'll discuss some of these other technical matters in that place. All right. Here's what it is. I'll describe it that later. He's going to play it again several times. Point is, you have 3 basic parameters you have to look at in order to understand how our economy is functioning. The lower curve, the one that's descending, these are all in terms of per capita rates. We have been descending in terms of the employment in productive labor, such as agriculture, infrastructure, basic physical production, over this period, per capita. The ratio is declining, and the percentile of the total throughput of the economy has been declining in these terms. We've also had an increase in the monetary aggregates and the financial aggregates. Now what's happened is we're building up a monetary debt built at a skyrocketing rate relative to a declining actual physical output and production. But you can see in any community, how many factories are there? How many farms are there? How many farmers are there? What's the level of productivity? Was it backward or is it progressive? Is it technological progress? What's the effect of the loss of the automobile industry in this physical output relationship? Now, but at the same time, we've had essentially since 1966, we've had a skyrocketing increase under the influence of the Vietnam War economy, a skyrocketing increase in the amount of monetary obligation. We've also had an increase in the financial aggregates. Now what has happened now is we've moved to a period in which these values, as you'll see, the financial aggregates have begun to fall. This decline in financial aggregates, which has occurred just recently in this last period, is the onset of the breakdown crisis. So we are dealing with this kind of situation, not what you're reading in the newspapers. This is what I presented also back in 2007 in defining the problem which we face now. Either we fix this problem, as I described it, or we don't make it as a nation. This comes to another big problem. Since the Peloponnesian Wars, European and extended civilization has been ruled by monetary systems. That is, we've been ruled by money, by powers which are largely private powers, which control money. Now, idiots keep talking about empires like you have one country is an empire because it rules over other countries. That's not what an empire is. Never was an empire. People who don't know their history and don't know their science don't understand, don't make that mistake. An empire is based on all empires, especially those which have existed since the Peloponnesian War, have always been based on monetary systems. They have been based on international systems. The Roman Empire was an international system. It was not the rule of Rome, of the Mediterranean by Rome. The Roman Empire was created on the Isle of Capri by a meeting between the representatives of three empires. And this was the Middle East, this was the Rome, and Egypt. And an empire is under the law which defines an empire historically. The empire is a lawgiver over nations. In other words, it is not a nation governing other nations, it is an international agency over all nations, which has a capital in some place, and the capital changes. And since the decline of the Byzantine Empire and the rise of Venice, all empires based on Europe or European civilization have been centered in the monetary center of Venice. So Venice is actually the capital of the empire, not London. London has been chosen as the Roman Empire was chosen as an arrangement. And that's what we're up against. What the power is international money. Look now, here we are. Go back to 2007, where I made this proposal for reform. I said we propose reform on the basis of the authority of the Constitution of the United States. That would have worked. Anybody who's intelligent, who understands the system, would have known that what I proposed then would have worked. We would not be in the mess today. But who the hell came up with this other idea of getting the United States into debt for obligations it didn't owe in order to bail out London, to bail out the international monetary system at the expense of the United States, to loot the United States and its treasury for the benefit of an international monetary cartel? What about bailout? To whom did we bail out? Did we bail out our industries? Did we save the auto industry or put it in an equivalent form, something else besides autos? Did we save the American farmer? Did we save the infrastructure of the cities of the United States and the states? Who did we bail out? We bailed out the London bankers and their New York extension. We don't owe them anything. We just have to have a government that says that. This is our nation, and the law of bankruptcy of our nation is our authority. If I were president, I would end this thing right now. And I'm sure I could get the support of the great majority of the American citizens very quickly, simply by making clear what I intend to do. Put the whole thing in bankruptcy. You guys are going to live. We're not going to kill you like Obama's doing. We're not cutting you off from health care. We're not trying to accelerate your death. We're not trying to get you to kill yourself. You're going to live. You're going to be employed. We're going to rebuild our industries. We're going to cancel this filthy debt we never really owed in the first place. Only some crooked traders or traders kinds of people gave us this kind of debt. It's not real. We don't owe it. We're going to go back to a credit system. And we're going to get some power. How's we going to get power? We're going to have Russia as a partner. And Russia needs a credit system desperately to solve its problems. But Russia can do a lot of things for us. Russia has vast mineral resources in the Siberia and related areas. These mineral resources are required for the development of nations because the Russians are very good at this. They're sitting on top of territory which has rich mineral resources. We have below, in the south of that, we have China and other countries which have a shortage of these mineral resources. Therefore, the development of Russia is building up as a power for power of science and development is necessary for Europe, for Russia itself, for China, so forth. Japan's possibility of existing depends upon this success of China and Russia. China requires cooperation with us and Russia. We require cooperation with China. For example, what about the debt of the United States to China, the dollar debt, the unpaid debt to China? What happens to the world if the unpaid debt to China is written off because the United States dollar collapses? What happens to the world then? China collapses. China goes into a crisis. Well, under those conditions, what happens? India is destroyed, not so much by an economic crisis, but by the chaos engendered throughout the world, where the spillover of what you're seeing in Afghanistan and Pakistan and so forth, it now spreads into there and causes chaos there. So what we simply do is we take these four great nations. We use these four great nations as a pivot. Japan will jump in immediately. South Korea will jump in immediately. Other nations will jump in immediately. But we have to get the four big nations to cooperate on an agreement, and the others will gather and we'll have a large agreement. We then create a new international system, entirely a credit system consistent with the design of the credit system built into the U.S. Constitution. All monetarism is canceled. The only honor is the honorable debt, which can be converted to a debt in a credit system. And the world will operate under an international credit system based on cooperation on a fixed exchange rate system among credit systems of nations of the world. We will then generate in the range of 1.5% to 2% basic long-term loans among nations based on credit systems. These loans will be directed largely to the driver of technological progress in basic economic infrastructure. It will mean largely the basis of immediate going to the one, let me shift this. What do you do when you want to develop a society? Do you build from the bottom up? Not really. Animals build from the bottom up, like beavers. And beavers are good for beavers. But I'm not a beaver. I don't do this underwater thing too well. I get cold, you know. Anyway, so what we do is we simply take it and go to a space program. Why? Because if you want to conquer something, you want to accomplish something in progress, you have to mobilize yourself by going to a higher platform than you are standing on now. Go beyond, go in the imagination, beyond what you think you should be doing now, and go to a higher level. Because remember, progress is something of building for the future. So to build for the future, you have to define the future. You have to define your destination. Building for the future, you're talking about generations. Generally, at least 2 generations. You're talking about 50 years ahead. So look at the horizon. Where do we want to be 50 years from now? In terms of technology, in terms of effects for humanity. Good people can understand 50 years. It's a short time. Some people live 50 years, even these days. It's a short time. So look 50 years ahead. Well, I say 50 years ahead, we're going to be on Mars. And we would define where we are today by defining the objectives we have to fulfill to get to Mars 50 years from now. Because this means, for example, technology. You cannot travel, you can send junk to Mars, you can send equipment to Mars, you can send robots to Mars. Can you send people? Because in going there, you've got over, talking about 200 days or so forth, that order of magnitude of travel. You're going to put somebody out in zero gravity, or nearly zero gravity, for the better part of a year? You think you're going to get living people at the other end? At the other depot that you're going toward? No. So you have to think about a gravitational magnetic field environment. You have to create an artificial environment of gravitation. Now, when you take a person inside a spacecraft at a constant rate of acceleration, deceleration, and you're trying to move them from one planet to another, or the outskirts of one planet to the outskirts of another, you have to have a magnetic field, and you have a gravitational field. You're now in this phase which Einstein defined as relativity. When you are riding in a craft which is doing that, you are in a relativistic environment, not in the ordinary kind of environment you think of. Constant acceleration, constant deceleration. Now, to send people safely to Mars, you've got to think in those terms. What I've said does not solve all the problems, but it indicates the nature of the problem that you have to solve. We have people left over from 40 years ago who were thinking in this direction. And even some people were still thinking in that direction, even in the early 1980s, as I was, and before. Now, 40 years later, a younger generation has no knowledge of this, or virtually no knowledge of this. And yet this younger generation, people who are now in their 20s and 30s, young 30s, are the people who are going to have to decide this and decide on it, because they're the adult generation which is going to decide on this thing. We, therefore, as a nation and a people and among nations, have to see this objective that we're going to reach within 50 years. Now, we're going to then think about the technologies that will get us there, and we're going to think about the technologies we are going to need when we arrive. So our job is to adopt ranges like that. It means that we've got to abandon environmentalism, which is a form of insanity. It's a killer. It's mass murder. If you do not develop the economy, do not develop technology, you're not going to be able to sustain the population. If you can't sustain the population, you're going to kill them, aren't you? So therefore, you have to always go to the newer technologies which are needed to enable you to provide the conditions of life required. In general, the way we measure this scientifically is in what is called energy flux density. That is, take how many calories, for example, of power, or watts of power, are you transmitting per cross-sectional unit of 1 centimeter per second. That's your measure. Now, as we diminish the natural resources of the planet in concentration, we have not diminished the natural resources of the planet. We've diminished the concentration because we take the richest resources and we use them up first because they're the most advantageous to use. But the ocean is full of the minerals. The greatest concentration of minerals on this planet available to mankind is in the oceans. But it's not very economical to try to gather all this stuff from these oceans, not now. So we have to increase our energy flux density where we can increase the productive power of mankind so that the individual has more powerful now than before. And this is the basis of improving productivity. So we have to move ahead, think about technologies, think about the technology of the future, develop a population that can deal with these technologies, and go ahead with optimism. You know, the old days, a grandfather would take his grandson out to a project in which he had participated in building. And he would say to this grandson, I built this for you to use. The sense of immortality, which is the sense of morality in human beings, which is absent in the animals, is always like that. Why are you living? For what you get out of life? What is it you get out of life? Are you living for what you are going to embody in your grandchildren, their descendants, and the future of the nation? Do you take pride in devoting your life to some purpose which future generations will enjoy? Do you have a sense of participation in the future, of an earned participation in the future, because you are contributing to its existence? That's what we are. That's what we are as American people when we are normally ourselves. That's what we used to be like before these recent developments. We used to think about what we were contributing to our grandchildren. We used to be joyous about seeing our grandchildren and seeing that we had contributed something to make life better for them than it had been for us. We look back at previous generations in our country, and we think of people who were able to do that, of the great advances in humanity. And the worst problem of this president is he has no morality. He has no commitment to people and our descendants. He has no commitment to the future of humanity. All great people, like people in warfare, have been willing to surrender their life for the sake of the benefits of coming generations when they thought that was necessary. They did not think of losing something because they lost their life. Yes, losing their life is losing their life. But they did not think morally of losing something because they had sacrificed their lives for the sake of coming generations. Most parents in former times sacrificed much of their lives for the sake of their children and grandchildren. And they rejoiced in what they saw in the result when they were old. And they thought of people, of their own ancestors who had died. And they thought generously of them because they recognized what they had given to them and desired to be as good in the eyes of their descendants as they saw their predecessors in their own eyes. It's this sense of immortality that despite we die in the flesh, we must be immortal in the spirit. And the spirit must decide what our duty is, not the flesh. We maintain the flesh so the spirit may function. And we organize society based on great principles which go to that point. We have a junk heap. If we don't do something soon, this country is going to go into chaos. It may end up in a bloody dictatorship. It may end up in a dark age, a planetary dark age. The way we're going, all those evils are things we now deserve for our negligence.
All right, don't we love how YouTube tells us what to watch next? All right, so I suspect that was not a discussion in the economic terms that most people are used to. So I first of all want to just ask Bob and then Brian to make a few brief remarks from the standpoint of what they will be discussing in the course of the next couple of weeks in relation to what we just saw.
Yeah, I can be heard, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's kind of hard to follow Lynn. I would just say before I talk about what's going to be upcoming in the next few weeks, I suspect that there are some people in this meeting, in this Zoom meeting, who perhaps have never seen a video of Lyndon LaRouche or seen him live, giving a class, giving a speech, addressing an audience. And I hope, in fact, I would be shocked if people did not realize what they just saw. This is a man who should have been president of the United States. And if he had been elected president of the United States, we would not be in the mess that we're in today. So I'm very interested in the, we have over an hour left here. I'm very interested to see what people's response is to what they just watched, what they just heard, what Mr. LaRouche just had to say. Otherwise, I'll just tell you that there's going to be at least 3 follow-up discussions to this. I'm going to present some material next Saturday. That will be not 2 weeks from tonight. We're not going to do anything on the Memorial Day weekend, but 2 weeks from tonight, I'm going to present some material. That'll be followed up a week later by Brian Lance, who has just authored a remarkable research paper, which I believe we're going to try to get segments of posted on our website, on how all of the destruction we've witnessed of our productive economy, well, Brian will have more to say on this, but how all of the destruction that we've lived through of our productive economy over the last 20 to 30 years, and particularly since 2008, how this all absolutely can be reversed if we readopt the principles and policies of national banking. So that will be Brian. And then after that, the third presentation is going to be something that Brian and I will do together as a joint conversation, joint discussion with the participants, with the audience, elaborating further on a number of these things. Now, as to what I'm going to do next week, really one of the things that just struck me about what Lynn said, what Lynn went through, I mean, he went through a lot, obviously, but one of the things that struck me is that a lot of people make this far more complicated than it really is. And it's because we have been living under this system of central banking. And in particular, since 2008, we've been living under a virtual dictatorship of the Federal Reserve. And people see things like the Davos conference and this financial oligarchy, which is running things, and people get overawed by it. It's like, how are you going to do this? These people are so powerful. And you listen to the directness and the confidence that you just heard from Lyndon LaRouche. This is not complicated at all. As Lynn said, we declare the Federal Reserve bankrupt. We put it into bankruptcy receivership. We create a national bank, which then becomes the means through which the U.S. Treasury circulates legal U.S. money, Treasury notes, and we begin the process of rebuilding the economy. Now, there's a lot of aspects to that, but the approach that needs to be taken is very straightforward. And the problem is people have come to accept the axioms of this central banking system such that they don't really comprehend really that what needs to be done is very basic in its approach and is very doable, and it will work. So, we'll discuss more of that. But what I'm going to try to go into next week or in 2 weeks, is this, I'm not going to go into details of national banking. We've actually covered that in a lot of previous classes and discussions. You just heard more of it, among other things, from Lyndon LaRouche. What I want to go into is really something that we've run up against in the organizing for many, many years, and we continue to run up against it, which is the failure of people to really understand the British question. Lynn talked about Venice, he talked about London, but what we are really talking about here is a system of oligarchy. And that's what we're in today. If you look at the participants in the World Economic Forum, they're all central bankers, multinational corporations, various, associations, associated with this. This is an oligarchical system. And we declared our independence against such a system in 1776, and we need to do so again today. So I'm going to address this British question in 2 weeks, and certain aspects of it, and to try to get people to not be afraid of it. It's so big, it's so powerful. It's a system that's dying in front of us. It's on its last legs. We simply need to get organized and have the courage to get our political leaders to replace this system, to go back to the principles, the economic principles, which actually created and built the United States of America. That's our, you could say, if you're in a war, you have a war aim. Well, that's our war aim. And as Lynn said, to create a future to be future oriented, of how do we leave the next generation and the generation after that with a better nation, with a better world, with a more productive economy. It can all be done. It's all realizable. And that's really all I would say right now.
All right, thanks, Bob. All right, Brian, go ahead. And before Brian starts, just let people know, we'll open it up for broader discussion after Brian finishes his remarks. So if you want to get in the queue, you can raise your hand by hitting the raise hand icon. If you're on the phone, hit *9, and then we'll call on you and you can unmute yourself. So Brian, go ahead.
Well, for here, I'm going to keep my remarks shorter because, we're already an hour into this program. But I would just start, with the comment of Lynn, who we've all worked with in the past, about an earned participation in the future. And that's what's expressed in the concept of long-term credits. It's not a matter of going out and indebting people, and so you can gain a revenue stream ad infinitum. It's long-term credits, not debt, and it expresses and has to express an intention, a national intention, which is this matter of getting people off the couches, off the sidelines. That was a nice thing about. Not nice, but it lulled people to sleep. So for some people that was relatively nice, I guess. But the Federal Reserve System says, oh, well, we'll take care of everything. It'll all happen magically through the marketplace, and we're going to make sure that marketplace operates accordingly. Well, of course, it's not. It's completely the opposite. It's a predatory. It's an oligarchical system. It's a central banking system. You know, the 24 major financial institutions with which the Fed, through which the Fed issues money. You know, that money goes to derivatives. It goes into the financial gambling, commodities, speculation, and everything else that's making our lives lousy. But let's look at a couple of elements of this in terms of long-term, you know, thinking in terms of long-term credits, very briefly. You know, agriculture. Look, we got to pay farmers. You know, the average farmer in this country on what he earns on the farm loses money every year. You know, that's not the hobby farmer, that's the farmer. 75% plus of the income of the average farm family is made, you know, in town. You know, it's made off the farm. You know, farmers are subsidizing our food. Okay, when you go to the grocery store, any of us go to the grocery store, you know, we're not paying the farmer. We're paying, you know, the meat packing, grain, and fertilizer cartels, you know, who are stripping out the income streams. We got to bring the producer and all of us closer together. After all, we should be the producers ourselves. We should be participating in creating the future. So, you know, I just take corn production. We burned 40% of corn in ethanol, 40%. That's 30 million acres devoted to, to producing dent corn, field corn, to burn as ethanol. You know, and we can't get baby food, baby formula, and so forth and so on. So you can look at this again. We have steel production. If you're going to build a national rail system, well, you're talking about, you know, close to 200 tons of steel per rail in freight rail. You know, anyway, you can imagine the figures, and we'll go through a lot of this. You know, what we need, we're going to need a whole bunch, at least 9, 10 more integrated steel mills to produce what we require. And we can, with national credit. So we'll take up a lot of those aspects of the picture, but maybe I should just stop there.
All right, great. I think that's going to give people a sense of the work that we're going to have to do in the coming weeks.